If she told you her name is Alice, she's lying. And your name. What the fuck is your name?
There are many things that come to mind when one thinks of director David Lynch. Master of the mundane as much as the uncanny and the bizarre, Lynch is known for taking a viewer's average, everyday experiences and twisting them up with themes of horror, the subtle power of the subconscious, and the monsters creeping in the corners of our own minds. In order for the audience to become truly immersed in his work, Lynch must create an environment that encourages the exploration of illogical thought and unmoors the audience from their constrained views of reality. Nothing cuts the audience free of these chains more than David Lynch's habit of creating characters with unfixed identities. Characters with unfixed identities are the most important hallmark of Lynch's work, uprooting the last vestiges of stability for the viewer, the very identity of the character with which the audience is traditionally supposed to identify, allowing them to be fully immersed in the illogical and non-rational worlds that his films create. David Lynch was born on January 20th, 1946, to Edwina and Donald Lynch in Missoula, Montana. His obsession with unfixed identities can be traced back to his childhood and early life. Lynch himself admits to leading a very segmented life.
So I still was living like maybe 3 lives now. Because I had those friends and I would do stuff with them. I had my home life, I would do stuff there. And then I had the studio. So you act and speak and think one way in this environment. Then you act and speak and think in this other environment, totally different. I kept things very separate.
It makes sense then to draw a connection between this segmentation and the emergence of unfixed identities in his work. Moving from place to place throughout childhood allowed him to observe people from all over the country. His compartmentalized social life, developing particularly in Virginia and on through his life in Philadelphia, would have made him intimately familiar with the fluid nature of personality and the multiplicity that can exist within one's own identity. Although Lynch may be the first name that comes to mind when thinking of unfixed identities in cinema, he was certainly not the first director to play with the idea of multiplicity of self in his films. The pioneering work by Maya Deren, sometimes referred to as the godmother of American experimental cinema, paved the way for filmmakers like Lynch. With her visual interpretation of multiple selves and her nonlinear storytelling, it is easy to spot the similarities between the bodies of work of these two filmmakers. However, as we will see, Lynch took the concept of unfixed identities to a new level, introducing his cast of kaleidoscopic characters to his feature films, both independent and mainstream. An overarching element of Lynch's work is the nonlinear structure he employs, evocative of the subconscious. The unfixed identities of his characters mirror the conventions of these dreams and fantasies, where sequential action is not as important as metaphorical action and sense is derived from feeling rather than fact. Early examples of this can be seen in Lynch's first feature film, Eraserhead. Henry struggles between two identities, his role as an individual and his role as a father. The conflict between these identities is externalized in the strange, theatrical dream space where Henry's head pops off and is replaced by that of the baby. This mirrors the mechanics of an anxiety dream, in which the cause of the anxiety, in this case the role of the father versus the role of the individual, manifests itself and takes over the dreamer. Lynch's 1997 film Lost Highway, however, is perhaps the best example of unfixed identities mirroring the conventions of dreams and fantasy. As Todd McGowan states in his work, Finding Ourselves on a Lost Highway, at the moment when Peter is about to have Alice, he loses her. The fantasy dissolves, and he falls back into his identity before the fantasy. The structure of fantasy can only be pushed so far. It is not a solution, but rather, as McGowan claims, a false exit, promising a fulfillment of desires but unable to deliver on that promise. The shifts in identity between Peter and Frank coincide with the departure from and return to reality. The fantasy comes close to completion but cannot quite follow through, just as Peter comes close to achieving what Frank could not, but still ultimately falls short. Additionally, the unfixed identities that Lynch creates allow for a holistic exploration of character, allowing him to show his characters' innermost desires as well as their ideal selves. For example, the unfixed identity of Frank in Lost Highway allows the audience to view two sides of the character: the outward mask that Frank shows to the world and his inner desires, played out by his alter ego Peter. By watching the dramatic romance between Peter and Alice, the audience gains a better sense of what Frank believed was missing from his relationship with Renee. Peter's murder of Andy shows how far he was willing to go to satisfy his desire for his mysterious lover, simultaneously revealing what drove the seemingly docile Frank to murder his wife. The fantasy identity of Peter explicitly shows Frank's desires in a highly visceral way, giving the audience a window into Frank's internal experience, which would otherwise be inaccessible. No figure in Lynch's work, however, better demonstrates how unfixed identities can be used to explore character more than Diane from Mulholland Drive. Diane creates Betty, her young and spirited ideal ego just arriving in Hollywood. Betty is sweet but not naive, she is talented but not arrogant, and she is selfless yet still successful. As Todd McGowan explains, this distortion of fantasy allows Betty to be all things. For the audience, Betty is an embodiment of everything that Diane wishes her life could be, an oxymoron of a character that somehow succeeds in the Hollywood system while remaining uninjured by its corruption. Without the first half of the movie featuring Betty, the audience would not have the same nuanced understanding of the character of Diane. We see everything Diane could be if the corrupt Hollywood system had allowed it, casting her in the light of sympathetic victim rather than the two-dimensional villain she could have been without the narrative of Betty. These unfixed identities serve a technical function as well, driving the narrative forward and inciting action in Lynch's films. Many of the plots of his films would not be possible without the inciting action of an unfixed identity. The central plot of Lynch's 1984 adaptation of Dune was Paul Atreides' transitional identity from Duke's son to the Messiah of the Fremen people. Though most likely a plot point taken from the source material, the shifts in identity were distinctly Lynchian in style, coinciding with meditative dream states and an unclear timeline. Without the fluid identity of Paul, there would be no driving narrative in Dune. The double life of Jeffrey, living both as boy next door and secretly as an amateur detective, is important to the plot of Blue Velvet as well. Without Jeffrey meddling in the investigation of Dorothy and Frank, there would be no mystery to explore in the film. Another example of Jeffrey's unfixed identity is his relationship to Frank. Although seemingly opposites, Jeffrey exhibits the potential to become Frank when reduced to his most basic instincts and desires. For example, when Jeffrey hit Dorothy out of frustration. The plot of the film is further driven forward by Jeffrey's internal struggle with this deeper layer of his identity. Twin Peaks also centers around unfixed identities. The identity of Laura Palmer shifted depending on who Agent Cooper spoke with, painting her as a completely different person around her parents, her friends, and those involved in her illegal activities such as drugs and prostitution. One can clearly see the parallels of segmented personality, although taken to dark extremes, between Laura Palmer and Lynch's own early life. This shifting identity made her murder all the more complicated to solve. The unfixed identity of Leland Palmer, the vessel for Laura's demonic murderer Bob, is also central to the plot. The unfixed identity of Leland is the key to solving the tagline of the show, Who Killed Laura Palmer? In her work, The Passion of David Lynch, Martha Nochimson claims that, in order to solve this mystery, Cooper must confront the existence of Bob, a discovery for which neither super sleuth technology nor complex Holmesian strategies will avail. This observation not only demonstrates the necessity of the unfixed identity of Leland in order for the mystery to be resolved, but also touches upon the themes of alogic that Lynch loves to portray in his work. Undercutting the usual logical progression of police work with elements of the supernatural forces the characters to confront the blurred boundaries between reality and the subconscious that exist in Twin Peaks. Taken as a whole, no one word can encapsulate the collage of Lynch's work. Lynch's style of filmmaking is best represented by the unfixed identities which they contain, unrestrained by the confines of linear reality and shifting dramatically through the whole spectrum of human experience that is somehow contained within each one.